I have three older sisters. They and their husbands all work in government ministries. Some are chairs of the People's Political Consultative Conference, while others are leaders or number ones in government agencies. People envy them and esteem them. Outsiders all say, "Look at your older sisters. Each one is better than the last." Whenever I heard things like this, I felt a bit sad in my heart. My older sisters were also exceptional, but my husband and I were only general management personnel in a company with no power or influence. It made me feel really ashamed, and I couldn't hold my head high in front of others. I started to think, I'm never going to amount to anything in this life. I have to pin my hopes on my son, hoping that when he grows up, he will be sure to find a good job. At the very least, even if he doesn't become a public servant, he must get into a government agency or public institution. If my son were able to stand out from the crowd and find a respectable job, I would be able to bask in the reflected glory. My son had just started elementary school when I began making plans for him. At the time, there was a private school that offered a better education. I pulled strings and spent money so my son could go there. I wanted him to do well in his studies, so in the future he would get into a university. Unfortunately, my son was a bit of a disappointment. Not only did he not knuckle down and study, but he also regularly skipped school. He would always be in confrontation with the teachers, and later he didn't even want to go to school. I started to worry that if he didn't go to school, then he would be destined for the scrap heap. Would he be able to have any good prospects after that? I would often say to him, "You need to study hard. Then in the future, when you get into a good university and find a good job, you will be very respectable. Your older cousins are all at university. If you don't study hard, then in the future, you will have to do hard physical work, and people will look down on you for your whole life." But my son didn't want to listen, and often hid from me. After he came home from school, he would grab a bite to eat and then go to his room, saying he needed to do his homework. I wanted to chat about his studies, but he wouldn't pay me any notice. I thought to myself, if I, as your mother, just let you act like this and don't take you in hand, will you be able to succeed in the future? I wrote down my worries and concerns, giving him earnest and sincere advice. But my son simply wouldn't listen and kept skipping school regularly. I grew afraid that he would fall into bad ways in society. So I asked someone to get him into the army. I hoped that he could get into a military school. If he could be a military officer in the future, that would be great. That way, if anyone asked later, "What does your son do?" I would be able to say with confidence, "My son is a military officer." Therefore, I sent him to the army when he was 15. After his 3-year service was up, I wanted to make use of a connection to send him to military school for further training. But he would not agree and resolutely wanted to be demobilized. I tried every way I could to convince him, nearly wearing out the skin on my lips in vain. But he still chose to be demobilized. When he returned, he was assigned to the railroad department to be an ordinary worker. Faced with this job, I was so thoroughly dissatisfied. The children of my older sisters had all walked the path of government officials. They had respectable and prestigious jobs, earned a lot of money, and people esteemed them wherever they went. But when I looked at my own son, He had no good education and no good job. How could he be so disappointing? Hadn't I done everything for his sake? How could he not understand? At that time, I often cried to myself and felt too ashamed to face people. Was my son's life really going to be as average and pathetic as mine? If the people who knew me found out, then who knows what they would say about me, or how they would mock me behind my back. No, I felt it could not carry on like this. I had to find a way to get my son reassigned to a good job. I couldn't let him be an ordinary worker all his life. I began to search out connections everywhere. My older sisters also helped with contacting several employers. But in the end, nothing came of it because of my son's lack of education. I was racking my brains over my son's work so much so that I became sick at heart. My family all advised me to let things take their course, but I wasn't willing to resign myself. I then forced my husband to ask someone to find a connection who could reassign my son's job. It took a lot of worry and a lot of money, but in the end, I still didn't get a new job for my son. Because of not finding a respectable job for my son, I didn't let him go to work for 3 years. I just made him wait at home. My son then became more and more decadent. Every day, if he wasn't playing games, he was out eating, drinking, and having fun. In those days, all I could think about was how to get my son a respectable job. I couldn't eat or sleep well because of this, and my life was hard and exhausting. Just when I was so worried and felt I had no way forward, the gospel of Almighty God came to me. After I accepted Almighty God's work of the last days, I often gathered and did duties with my brothers and sisters. Doing this, I felt happy and liberated. However, when I was at leisure, I couldn't stop myself from getting anxious about my son's work. One day, I read these words of God.
Almighty God says, when a person leaves their parents and becomes independent, the social environment they face and the kinds of jobs and careers they encounter are all predetermined and have nothing to do with their parents. Some people choose a good major in college and end up finding a plum job after graduation. It can be said that they get off to a flying start on the path of life. Others learn and master many different skills and yet never find a job that suits them or the position for them. Much less do they build a career of their own. It can be said that these people's first step in life is marked by setbacks and rough patches, their prospects dismal and their lives uncertain. Some others apply themselves diligently to their studies, yet narrowly miss every chance to receive a higher education. They seem doomed to never achieve success. It can be said that their very first hopes on the path of life go up in smoke. Not knowing whether the road ahead is smooth or rocky, they feel for the first time how unpredictable human destiny is, and so face life with a mixture of dread and expectation. Others are not very well educated, yet they can write books, achieving a measure of fame. And others are almost entirely illiterate, yet can make money in business and are thereby able to support themselves. What occupation one chooses, how one makes a living, whether the choices they make are good or bad. Do people have any choice in these things? Are they based on people's desires and decisions? Most people wish to work less and earn more, to not toil in the sun and rain, to dress respectably, to cut a dazzling figure wherever they go, to come out on top, and to bring honor to their ancestors. People have such perfect wishes, but when they take their first step in the path of life, they gradually come to see how imperfect human destiny is, and truly realize for the first time that though one can make bold plans for one's future and wantonly harbor all kinds of dreams, no one has the ability or the power to realize their own dreams, nor the ability to control their own future. There will always be a gap between one's dreams and the realities they're confronted with. Things can never turn out as one imagines them to, and faced with such realities, people can never find satisfaction or contentment. There are even some people who repeatedly try to come up with all kinds of approaches and explore every possible channel, and make all kinds of effort and sacrifices for the sake of their livelihoods and prospects, and for the sake of changing their fates. But in the end, even if they can realize their dreams and desires by means of their own hard work, they can never change their fates, and no matter how much they struggle, they can never go beyond their destinies. Regardless of differences in their abilities and intelligence, and whether or not they have resolve, people are all equal before fate, where they're not distinguished between great and small, high and low, exalted and mean. What occupation one engages in, what one does for a living, and how much wealth one has in life does not come down to their parents, their talents, or their efforts and ambitions. It comes down to the Creator's preordination.
I read this passage several times. The more I read it, the more I felt that what God said was absolutely true. Just as the words of God say, I always had my own ideas and plans, and hoped that my son could get a good job, with respect and prestige. However, none of this can be accomplished through the planning of humans, because God is sovereign over all our destinies and arranges them. We cannot achieve our wishes by relying on our own efforts and struggles. I paid so much to send my child to a private school while he was young. It was also he would study hard and have a good job and good prospects in the future. But he simply refused to listen and often skipped school. I earnestly and sincerely tried to teach him, but not only did he not listen to me, he even kept avoiding me. Later, I sent him to join the Army, hoping that in the future he would get into military school and become an officer. However, he still didn't listen to me and insisted on being demobilized, and became an ordinary railroad worker as a result. I was not willing to let things rest, because my son's job was so far off from my expectations. I searched everywhere, using my connections and trying to pull strings, and was willing to pay any price to get my son into the ideal job. But after several years of torment, and having expended a huge amount of money and effort, my wishes ultimately did not come true. From God's words, I understood that what jobs a person will do throughout their life is not decided by their hard work, ambition, or desire. God arranged long ago what jobs a person will do in this life and what their destiny is. It is not up to me what job my son can do and what his prospects will be. It is preordained by God. However much I made plans or asked people to use their connections, it was all no use. It was all in vain. Not only was living like this exhausting, I also had raised my son to become decadent. When I understood this, I prayed to God. I was willing to entrust my son to God and submit to God's orchestrations and arrangements. After I prayed, I felt much more relaxed. Later, 2 co-workers from my son's employer came to my house to find out what was going on. They said that my son had not worked for several years, and if he kept this up, he would be automatically dismissed. When I heard this news, I felt conflicted inside again. Will my son only ever be an ordinary worker in the future? I was still unwilling to accept it. So I asked my son, if you go back to work now, then in the future, a worker is all you'll be. What do you want to do? I didn't expect it, but my son agreed to go to work. At the time, I thought of these words of God.
Almighty God says, no objective conditions can influence anyone's mission as preordained by the Creator. Everyone reaches maturity in the particular environment in which they grow up. Then, step by step, they embark upon their own path in life and fulfill the destiny arranged for them by the Creator. Naturally and automatically, they enter the vast sea of mankind and assume their post in life, and, for the sake of the Creator's preordination and the sake of His sovereignty, they begin to fulfill their responsibilities as a created being.
God has already arranged my son's destiny and what jobs he will do throughout his life. Now my son had grown up, and I should let go. Since he was willing to go to work, I should let him. Not long after, my son went to his employer to work. Several years passed in a flash. Although I had been able to let go of the issue of my son's job somewhat, at Chinese New Year and other holidays, when the whole family came together, and I heard my older sisters talk about how their own sons had succeeded, I felt disheartened. I always felt like I was lesser than them and couldn't get a word in. There was a feeling I couldn't describe in my heart. I prayed to God. Dear God, from your words I have understood that you are sovereign over people's destinies. But why, when I hear my elder sisters talk about the successes of their own sons, do I feel sad like I'm beneath them? Dear God, may you guide me to understand my own problems. One day during my devotional, I read these words of God.
Almighty God says, in fact, no matter how grand man's aspirations are, no matter how realistic man's desires are, or how proper they may be, all that man wants to achieve, all that man seeks, is inextricably linked to 2 words. These 2 words are vitally important to every person throughout their life, and they are things Satan intends to instill in man. What are these 2 words? They are fame and gain. Satan uses a very mild method, a method that's very much in line with people's notions, and that isn't very aggressive, to cause people to unknowingly accept its means and laws of survival, develop life goals and life directions, and come to possess life aspirations. No matter how high-sounding people's descriptions of their life aspirations may be, these aspirations always revolve around fame and gain. Everything that any great or famous person, or in fact any person, chases throughout their life relates only to these 2 words: fame and gain. People think that once they have fame and gain, they have the capital to enjoy high status and great wealth, and to enjoy life. They think that once they have fame and gain, they have the capital to seek pleasure and to engage in wanton enjoyment of the flesh. For the sake of this fame and gain which they desire, people happily and unknowingly hand over their bodies, hearts, and even all that they have, including their prospects and fates, to Satan. They do so without reservation, without even a moment's doubt, and without ever knowing to reclaim everything that they once had. Can people retain any control over themselves once they have given themselves over to Satan and become loyal to it in this way? Certainly not. They are completely and utterly controlled by Satan. They have completely and utterly sunk into this quagmire and are unable to free themselves.
From God's words, I understood that I felt upset when I saw my older sisters praise how successful their sons were, because I attached too much importance to fame and gain. I was living by erroneous thoughts and views instilled in people by Satan, like man struggles upward, water flows downward, and aim to stand out and excel. I believed that if I had fame and gain, I would have everything, and I would be envied and esteemed wherever I went, and I would enjoy prestige. I thought that I would be able to stand tall in front of others and speak with confidence. I thought that only by living in this way would I have dignity. When I saw that my older sisters and their husbands were all respected figures and were esteemed wherever they went, I was very envious and wanted to become like them. I wanted to be esteemed and enjoy both fame and gain as well. When I did not achieve my wishes, I pinned my hopes on my son, hoping that he would get a respectable job. And this way, I would be able to stand tall and live with prestige. For this, I was willing to pay any price to cultivate my son. However, things did not turn out as I wished. My son simply did not listen to me and ended up becoming a worker. When I saw that my hopes had come to nothing, I felt great anguish. I constantly felt like I couldn't lift my head up in front of others and lived in suffering every day. I was not willing to see my son live an average and remarkable life, and spent money and called upon my connections to get my son reassigned to a new job. In the end, I had spent a lot of money, but didn't succeed in getting him a new job. My son had been at home every day with nothing to do and became useless. I suffered from pursuing fame and gain, only caring about my own face and my own interest. I didn't consider my son's feelings at all, and forced him to carry the dreams I had not been able to realize myself. To say nothing of hindering my son, I was also living in abject misery. All these satanic thoughts and views do to people is harm them. They are like invisible shackles fettering me tightly, making me willing to expend time and effort for them, even as they play me for a fool. How utterly foolish I was. When I understood this, it was as if a knot that had been in my heart for many years suddenly came undone. Without the guidance of God's words, I would have sunk deep into the quagmire of the pursuit of fame and gain, unable to extricate myself. I thanked the guidance of God's words. I now had some understanding of my own mistaken pursuits in the past, and was somewhat able to discern the ways in which Satan corrupts people. I was not willing to carry on living by Satan's thoughts and views, and resolved to stop interfering with my son's work. After that, I read a passage of God's words and learned how to treat my son's job correctly.
Almighty God says, God has preordained that someone will be an ordinary worker, and in this life, he will only be able to earn some basic wages to feed and clothe himself. But his parents insist on him becoming a celebrity, a wealthy person, a high-ranking official, planning and arranging things for his future before he reaches adulthood, paying various kinds of so-called prices, attempting to control his life and future. Isn't that stupid? No parent wishes to see their children become beggars. But even so, they don't have to insist that their children rise up in the world and become high officials or prominent people in the upper class of society. What's good about being in the upper class of society? What's good about rising up in the world? Those are quagmires. They are not good things. Is it a good thing to become a celebrity, a great figure, a superman, or a person with position and status? Life is most at ease when one is as just an ordinary person. What's wrong with living a slightly harder, more tiring life, with slightly worse food and clothes? At the very least, one thing is guaranteed. Since you do not come into contact with the upper class and do not live in the midst of social trends, you can at least sin less, do less evil, and do fewer things to resist God. As an ordinary person, you will face fewer temptations, and nobody will take heed of you. Though your life will be a bit harder and more tiring, at least you will have peace, not be tired, and feel less fear in your spirit. Think about it. As a worker or as a farmer, all you need to worry about is making sure that you can have 3 meals a day. It's different when you're an official. You have to fight, and you won't know when the day will come that your position is no longer secure. And that won't be the end of it. The people you've offended will seek you out to settle scores, and you will be tormented by them. Life is very tiring for celebrities, great people, and wealthy people. Wealthy people are always afraid that they won't be so wealthy in the future, and that they won't be able to go on if that happens. Celebrities always worry that their halos will disappear, and they always want to protect their halos, fearing that they will be eliminated by this era and the trends. Their lives are so tiring. Parents never see through to these things and always want to push their children into the heart of this struggle, sending them into these lions' dens and quagmires.
God's words made me understand that I should submit to God's sovereignty and predestination regarding my son's job. There is nothing bad about being a worker. You can clothe and feed yourself and maintain a normal life. Isn't this very good? However, I always wanted my son to take the path of being a government official or become a military officer and enter a government department. I saw that I was worshiping power and status, and what I was doing was pushing my son into the abyss. On the surface, governmental agencies appear to be respectable. The people who come out all wear suits and leather shoes. They all look very prestigious. But in reality, it is the darkest place there is. Take the sons of my older sisters. Although they are senior leaders in their organizations with much power and influence, they do not lead happy lives. All they talk about is how to use connections to protect their own status. They worry that one day they may lose their positions and be tormented by others. They truly are living on a knife edge. If you work in a government agency, you'll likely be sucked into various kinds of power struggles, and you can't escape even if you want to. Some give their lives to serve them, becoming the accomplices of Satan. Conscience, a moral bottom line, self-conduct, and human dignity all vanish. They do every bad thing there is, and do evil in many guises. Ultimately, they end up as a sacrifice to Satan. But I couldn't see through this, and even pushed my son toward government agencies. I really was too foolish. The job that God arranges for people is sufficient to maintain a normal life. just as God says. Be content with just having food and clothing. I had believed in God for many years, but never lived out the reality of God's words. My perspective on things had not changed very much, and my viewpoints on what to pursue were the same as those of worldly people. I worshipped power and pursued fame, gain, and status. I even pushed my son toward the abyss and the quagmire in order to realize my goal. If I had sent my son on a political career, he would have been dragged into conflicts and ended up overtly and covertly struggling with others. All day long, he would have had to be on his guard against this person or cautious of that person, deploying schemes and tricks. Who knows what sort of things he would have ended up doing. Pushing my son into that place to satisfy my pride and status, was that not harming my child? Although my son is now an ordinary worker and he suffers a bit physically and is somewhat tired, his life is not as tiring as that of his cousins. Neither has he been sucked into intrigue and struggles. He doesn't need to worry about losing position, and his life is relaxed and at ease. He can also support himself. Isn't this great? God's arrangements are always appropriate. Later, I was seeking through God's words. As parents, we should not constantly expect our children to stand out from the crowd. So, what is the correct way to treat our children? I read these words of God.
Almighty God says, through dissecting the essence of parents' expectations for their children, we can see that these expectations are selfish, that they go against humanity, and that they have nothing to do with the responsibilities of parents. When parents impose all sorts of expectations and requirements on their children, they place a great deal of extra pressure on them. This is not them fulfilling their responsibilities. So, what are the responsibilities that parents ought to fulfill? At least, they should teach their children to be honest people who speak the truth and do things in an honest manner, and teach them to be kind-hearted and not to do bad things, guiding them in a positive direction. These are their most basic responsibilities. Parents just need to fulfill their responsibilities to their children, bring them up, and raise them into adults. They don't need to raise their children into talented individuals. Is this easy to achieve? This is an easy thing to do. You do not need to bear any responsibility for your children's futures or lives, or develop any plans for them, or presuppose what kind of people they'll become, what kind of lives they'll have in the future, what social circles they'll be found in, what their quality of life will be, or what kind of status they'll have among people. You don't have to presuppose or control these things. You just have to fulfill your responsibilities as a parent, raising them into adults. It's as easy as that.
From God's words, I found a path of practice. A parent's responsibilities to their children, before they reach adulthood, are to bring them up and raise them into adults, and guide them to walk on the correct path. Parents should let go of their adult children and let them live their lives. When their children need help, parents can help them according to their own actual circumstances. Now, my son is an adult. He has his own thoughts and makes his own choices. I should not interfere with and orchestrate his life to satisfy my own desires. What I can do is provide suggestions and advice when he is in difficulty, and give him positive guidance. But what he chooses is up to him. In the future, questions like whether he will always remain a worker, what people and things he will come into contact with, and what kind of life he will lead have all been arranged by God. They are not within my control. What I can do is to submit and fulfill the responsibilities of a parent. Now, I no longer worry and tire myself out over my son's job, and I'm not embarrassed and constrained by it anymore. I can quiet my heart and pour my heart into my duties. By living in this way, my heart feels at ease and relaxed.